This is the National Museum of Australia, built on the banks of Lake Burley Griffin, here in Canberra, Australia's national capital. This place was opened in 2001 as part of the celebrations of Australia's centenary of Federation. You might think that museums are pretty dull places, but I can tell you this one certainly isn't. In fact, it's very high-tech and there are some fantastic displays to see. Things in museums are not just relics from the past. Each and every object that you see here has a story to tell. They tell us about where we've come from and how we've become what we are today. But they also reveal mysteries from Australia's past. Mysteries about convicts and explorers. Mysteries about gold miners and outlaws. Mysteries about conflict and rebellion. And these are the mysteries that we want you to help us solve. Our first mystery involves this person, Captain James Cook and his ship the Endeavour. Now, many people still think that this explorer was the first to discover Australia.
But was he? In this mystery, you'll get the chance to look at old records and lots of evidence which clearly shows that Asian and European explorers visited here hundreds of years before Cook. And you'll also discover that Aboriginal people have been here for tens of thousands of years. The clues to this mystery can be found in ancient human remains, paintings, cannons, and maybe a lost ship buried beneath the sand dunes.
I'm now in the Horizons Gallery, and this sign gives me a clue to our second history mystery: prison without walls, life and work in convict society. Now, if you look here at the exhibits, the artefacts and the objects, you'll find a lot about convict life. But there's not much about convict women. And I know that thousands of convict women were sent to Australia. So how do I find out about their lives? Where were they kept? How old were they? And how did they manage to survive in this strange and sometimes hostile country? Now, to do this, to solve this mystery, we're going to have to get our hands dirty. We're going to have to dig deep into history. And we're going to go to an archaeological site somewhere in Tasmania to find the clues to this mystery. The third mystery that we're going to investigate happened in Victoria in 1854, and it involved bloodshed and rebellion. Now, this was a fantastic time in Australian history because hundreds of thousands of people from all corners of the world flocked to the goldfields of New South Wales and Victoria, hoping to strike it rich. But few were lucky. Many were unlucky. And there were lots of the miners who were very upset with the way they were treated on the goldfields by the police and the Goldfields administration. So what happened? What caused the Eureka Rebellion in 1854?
Could the bloody Eureka Rebellion have been avoided? And what clues can you find that might have changed the course of history?
This display of spears and guns signposts yet another bloody mystery involving people who lived in another time and another place.
And the interesting thing about this is that there's a monument in a park somewhere in Perth that has managed to keep this debate alive more than 100 years after the event occurred. So you're going to have to visit this monument with us, walk in the footsteps of the explorers, read their journals and diaries, and try and find some evidence from the Aboriginal people themselves that will help us to solve the mystery of why this bloody frontier battle occurred.
This is one of my favourite places at the National Museum of Australia. It's called the Circa Theatre, and it's fantastically high-tech. And when you visit here, you'll see literally millions of images of things that make us Australian. You'll also experience three themes: land, the nation, and the people. And you'll also notice that there are some heroes on these high-tech screens. One of these heroes is Ned Kelly. And our mystery is to try and work out whether, in fact, Ned should be here. Was he a hero, or was he in fact a villain? You'll get the chance in this history mystery to put Ned Kelly on trial. Let's get stuck into it. And what better place to start Australian history mysteries than with the discovery of Australia? Have you ever wondered how we know that Australia looks like this? And who was responsible for discovering and mapping our island continent? Well, when I was at school, the answer was obvious. Captain Cook. All the textbooks said so. Cook sailed his ship the Endeavour across from New Zealand in 1770, bumped into the east coast of Australia, claimed it, encountered Aboriginal people, named it, sailed up it, then 18 years later, the first fleet sailed into Sydney Cove. End of story. Is that what you still learn? Well, I started to change my mind when I began to look at some things in museums, like these maps. This one looks like part of Australia, but it was drawn 150 years before Cook by Dutch explorers. And this one shows other parts of the coastline, such as Cape York and the Torres Strait, discovered by Spanish and Dutch explorers over 100 years before Cook. Now that can't be right. Or this bark painting. It shows a meeting between the crew of a Macassan prau or boat and the local Aboriginal people of Groote Island, situated off the coast of Northern Territory. The Macassans came from what is now called Indonesia, and there's evidence that shows that they had contact with Aboriginal people well before Cook was in the area. So how can he be the first person to discover a place where people from another country were regularly visiting and trading? I've come right down here to the southwest coast of Victoria, to the town of Warrnambool, and I've come to see this monument, presented by the government of Portugal to commemorate early voyages of navigation in these southern waters. One of these early voyages was taken by a person called Cristóvão de Mendonça in 1524, and the words here read something like this: "We've opened waters that no people have sailed before." 1524. Now that's more than 250 years before Captain Cook. I'm more confused than ever. Historians argue that Mendonça was sailing along this coastline when his ship was caught in a storm and was shipwrecked. Now the vessel was not sighted for 300 years until in 1836, after a storm, a hull was revealed. Other sightings occurred right up until 1880, and the people described it as a very different wood. They called it the mahogany ship because it was made of a timber that was not commonly used for shipbuilding at that time. They also said that they believed that it must have been there a long, long time before Captain Cook. So, where is the mahogany ship? Is it buried beneath these dunes? You know, legend has it that a big storm covered the ship again, and people have been searching for it ever since. There was even a time when there was a reward of $250,000 for its discovery. But did the mahogany ship in fact exist? Does it still exist today? Was it really an old Portuguese vessel centuries before Cook? Or just a fishing boat that people thought was much older than it really was? So we have many different clues as to who discovered and mapped Australia many thousands of years after Aboriginal people occupied the country. For some of these discoveries, there's solid evidence, but for others, there are still mysteries to be solved. Mysteries like the mahogany ship. This is the mystery that you're going to have to try and solve. Who discovered Australia? I reckon we've given you just about all of the clues. Let's try and put the pieces of the puzzle together. Remember when we visited the Horizons exhibition at the National Museum of Australia, and we looked at some of the relics from our convict past, and we asked the question, what's not here? How much can I really find out about the lives of female convicts? Now, I know that there were approximately 25,000 female convicts sent by Britain to Australia, but what else was I able to learn from that exhibition? The answer is not much. So to solve this mystery, we had to go elsewhere to find the clues. Well, here we are, a very quiet village called Ross in the Central Highlands of Tasmania. This is a tourist destination. It's a fantastic place because it's steeped in history. Old churches, graveyards, and this old bridge built by convict labour. In 1836, when Governor Arthur opened this bridge, he was so impressed with the intricate design that he rewarded the convict surveyor and the convict architect with their freedom. But that's a story about convict men. What about the women who came to Ross? What did they do and where did they live? Now, the convict women who came to Ross actually stayed here in this very prison. and the prison was called a female factory. What prison, I can hear you asking? The prison is buried. It's buried in this paddock, and we're going to try and find some of the clues to see what it can tell us about their lifestyle. Areas that can help solve mysteries sometimes disappear or are hidden underground. When that happens, we try to find information by digging up or excavating the area. This is called archaeology, which involves collecting, measuring and recording details of the artefacts that are discovered. It has to be done very carefully, and sometimes after the discoveries are made, the area is covered up again to preserve it for the future. And that's what's happened here. But we can still examine many of the things that were dug up. And when we look at them carefully and ask questions, we can start finding out about how the convict women lived. So, what we want you to do is to join the archaeological team that explored Ross to try and find out as much as you can about the lives of the female convicts that lived there. Now, to help you, we've brought you here to the female factory at Hobart, in the capital city of Tasmania, and history is all around us. You can still walk on the very ground that the female convicts walked on in 1828. We also know that 12,500 women passed through these walls. We know that 1,200 babies were born, and sadly, 900 died. But most importantly, here at this site, we have an archaeologist who is still working to try and solve the same sort of problem that you're trying to solve. Let's meet him.
One of the best places to look if I want to find out about how people lived here, I would want to look in these drains because although they still work, they've got enough soil in them to stop artefacts inside from getting washed away. And I might expect to find clay pipes, bottles and buttons and things like that that might have been used as currency in a place where there is no currency. And if I was a convict and I didn't want people to find them, that's the sort of place where I would hide them.
But we want you to solve the mystery of what life was like for female convicts here in Ross, using the archaeological evidence as well as stories and other information that exist. What did the women do? How did they survive? Let's get our hands dirty by digging up the past, and then we can come back later on and go through what we've been able to discover. So how did you get on? What did you find out by sifting through the evidence? Well, I've found out quite a lot, and the map I found out was very, very useful to me, and this place really has some significance for me now. So the crime area would have been here, and the hiring area over here. And I also found out where the chapel was. The chapel was back here, and beside it were the solitary cells. Remember, they're the ones that were called the dark cells, because time spent in these cells was pretty horrific. And as I look around here, I can virtually visualise the buildings, and I can get some sense of the life of what it must have been like for these convict women. So imagine you're one of the female convicts coming in for the first time to the crime class area. You're scared, lonely, worried. You're trying hard to fit in. And then you go over to the work area. And if you get a chance, you look through the bars to the world beyond, and you're wondering about your family and whether in fact you'd ever see them again. And each day you go to the chapel for prayers. And perhaps for you, the chapel is a symbol of hope and salvation. And knowing all the time that you had to stay out of trouble. Because if you did get into trouble, it meant solitary confinement in a dark, damp cell approximately this size, a mere 2 metres by 1.3 metres. Imagine what that would have been like. How could you possibly bear that existence? Well, for the convict women, it was only just bearable if they could smuggle in some extra food, tobacco, and the occasional tot of rum. You know, for a long time, Australians were ashamed of their convict past. The convict stain, we called it.
but it's pretty trendy to find a convict skeleton in your cupboard today. Perhaps you've got one. You know, the site of the female factory and the town of Ross itself, well, I reckon they're a very important part of my heritage. And I think I appreciate that more now that I've actually come here and walked on the same ground as my convict ancestors. Do you think it's an important part of your heritage? I hope so. I reckon probably every museum in the world has an exhibit made of gold. This is a reproduction of a gold nugget that was found in Western Australia in 1931. It's called the Golden Eagle. Now, it's probably pretty typical of some of the finds that were made in New South Wales and Victoria during the 19th century. And as you'll recall, that's when the Eureka Rebellion occurred. Now, over the last 50 or 60 years, many filmmakers have tried to recreate that event, and they've been faced with the same mystery as we are. What caused the event, and could it have been avoided? The Eureka Rebellion occurred on the 3rd of December, 1854, in Ballarat in Victoria. Now, this is Sovereign Hill, Ballarat, and as you can see, it's a wonderful recreation, a very accurate recreation of what a gold mining area would have looked like in the 1850s. There's a little stream here that's meandering through this valley, and there would have been many streams like this throughout the hills of Victoria where the gold miners searched for what we call alluvial gold. That's gold on the surface of the ground. Another very, very popular form of mining was this form of mining, where the miners actually sank deep shafts into the ground in search of rich veins of gold that ran throughout the hills of the countryside. And this is where part of the problem occurred. You see, on the Victorian goldfields, you had to take out a miner's licence. And some of the diggers were a bit concerned about this. A, you took the licence out before you actually found any gold. B, sometimes you didn't find any gold at all, so they felt in that case the licence was unfair. C, you had to carry the licence on you at all times. And this was pretty difficult. If one of the police yelled out, "Bring up your licence," and you're down there waist deep in water, you had to come up. You see, "Can I go to the tent to get my licence?" No, you had to carry it on you the whole time. And finally, the method of collecting the licence was sometimes unfair and brutal.
Where's your licences? Give me your licence!
Hey, what are you doing here, Trey? You've already been here today.
No, you talk to me! Where's your licence?
It's in the tent.
It's in your where?
It's in the tent.
It's in your tent! You've got to have it with you at all times! Give me your licence! I don't care!
And as you can see, things got pretty tense and out of hand. That culminated in a bloody rebellion that occurred on the 3rd of December on a Sunday morning almost 150 years ago. Sadly, this was the outcome. If you come here to the Ballarat Cemetery, you can find a memorial to the 6 soldiers who died at Eureka. But you'll also find a memorial to the 21 miners who perished. And you can pay your respects to men from all parts of the world. The miners came from England, Ireland, Scotland, Wales, Germany, and even Prussia. In the words of the famous Australian poet Henry Lawson, blood had stained the wattle.
But why? Why did it happen? And why did the event occur here at this very site, which is now commemorated by the Eureka Interpretation Centre, and not at other places where gold was discovered? And most importantly, could it have been avoided?
Now, to solve this mystery, you're going to have to go back in time to visit the Victorian goldfields. And you're going to get a chance to actually see if you can prevent the Eureka Rebellion from happening. If you can do this, you will have solved one of the most intriguing mysteries in Australian history. You know, modern Australia was founded by European settlers. But when the first fleet sailed into Sydney Cove in 1788, under the command of Captain Arthur Phillip, the Aboriginal people occupied the land. In their eyes, the British were invaders, people who would control the land over the next 200 years. Here, in the Gallery of the First Australians at the National Museum, we can see stark evidence that European settlement resulted in frontier conflict. You know, if we look very carefully at our own local environments, we can sometimes find evidence of frontier conflict that occurred between Aborigines and Europeans. Now, here at East Perth, at this old cemetery, we find the gravestone that's dedicated to 3 explorers who were attacked in 1864 and killed by Aborigines pretty close to a little town called Broome on the northwestern coastline of Western Australia. Now, the 3 men were Frederick Panter, James Harding and William Goldwire. And after the attack, their bodies were brought back here and buried in this very ground. Now, it's estimated that at the time, half of Perth's entire population attended the funeral. It must have been a very significant event. Now, we all know that memorials are evidence of the past. They're built to commemorate great events, to commemorate the works of great people, and this memorial's no exception. It's a public statement being made by the people. 130 years ago, they felt something significant had happened. This significant event should be remembered in history. Future Australians should be encouraged to learn about it. When you walk in this park, they wanted you to stop, look at this memorial and remember.
But it's also a memorial that says more than that. It's a memorial about a debate, because more than 100 years after that event, some people have come along here and they've placed another plaque beneath this one. And this plaque tells a very different story. It talks about the killing of Aboriginal people. People who tried to prevent invaders from Europe coming and taking over their country. So they're wanting us to walk in this park, to stop, to look and remember.
So this is the mystery you have to try and solve. Which version of the story on the monument is accurate? Which one of them is true? What really happened in Broome more than 130 years ago? Now, have a look at this object. It's a fairly gruesome looking thing. It belongs to the National Museum of Australia, but as you can see, it's not on display in one of their galleries. It's actually being stored here at this massive warehouse with hundreds of other objects. Now, these objects are kept here because museums really don't have the space to display everything that they own at the one time. So we bring them out as we change themes or we want to tell different stories about Australia's past. Now, looking at this, it looks pretty much like Ned Kelly's armour to me, but having spoken to the curators, in fact, it's not. It's a replica, and it was made for the 1970 film starring Mick Jagger. Now, many of you will know that Mick Jagger is the lead singer for the Rolling Stones. Terrific singer, one of my favourite singers, but as an actor, he wasn't very good, and the film didn't do very well. So why would the National Museum keep this object? Isn't it sort of a trivial piece of our history? Well, the answer is that oftentimes it's the trivial things of our past that can tell us so much about ourselves, about our heroes, about the things that we think are important and the things that we want to remember. This is the old Melbourne jail, and as you can see, there's nothing trivial about the exhibits on display here. In fact, these exhibits tell us a lot about Ned Kelly, our image of ourselves, who we would like to be now and perhaps what we would like to become in the future. This exhibit, opened 120 years after the death of Ned, is a very strong and emotional exhibit. It passes on the traditional image of Ned as the rebel against unfair authority, the man who stood by his mates, almost bigger than life, a man who died game. If someone says to you that you're as game as Ned Kelly, that's an ultimate compliment. Adults queue to see this exhibition. They come to see the helmet, the armour, the death mask, and they come to see the gallows itself. And children come as well. And what this says to me is that the children will go away and they'll take this traditional image with them. Not everybody shares the view that Ned Kelly was in fact a hero. Here outside the State Library of Victoria, there's a very, very impressive statue. But it's not a statue of Ned. In fact, it's a statue of the man who ordered Ned hanged, Judge Redmond Barry. But the statue's not here because he ordered Ned hanged. The statue's here because he founded the State Library. But this does, however, open up a question. Perhaps attitudes towards Ned Kelly are not all one way. Perhaps even today, there are those who believe that Ned Kelly was in fact a villain. This is Stringy Bark Creek in northeastern Victoria, and as you can see, it's pretty rugged country. Now, on the 26th of October 1878, 4 policemen came into this area to arrest the Kelly gang. They probably had orders to take them dead or alive, but in fact the gang ambushed the policemen and called on them to surrender. Now, according to Ned Kelly, Trooper Lonigan went for his gun, and Ned, in self-defence, had to shoot him. In the ensuing gun battle, 2 more policemen were killed, but one of them managed to escape on horseback into this rugged bush. Now, this was the first time that the Kellys had killed. Up until now, they'd stolen from people, they'd robbed them of their horses, and they'd even duffed some cattle. Like the Kellys, the police were Irish, and their families mourned and remembered. And when they came here to the Mansfield Cemetery to visit the graves of their loved ones, Scanlon, Lonigan, and Michael Kennedy, they read these words: cruelly murdered by armed criminals. So in their heart of hearts, the Kellys were murderers, and the deaths of their loved ones had to be avenged. For 2 years the Kelly gang was on the run, and they robbed the banks at Jerilderie and Euroa. And then it came down to this place, the last stand at Glenrowan, and one of the greatest stories in Australian history was about to unfold. The Kelly gang put on their armour and went into battle. Joe Burns, Steve Hart and Dan Kelly were either killed in the gunfight or in the fire that burned down Ann Jones's hotel. Ned sustained something like 28 wounds, but he survived, was captured, and, well, you know the rest of the story. So the mystery for you to decide is whether you believe that Ned Kelly was a noble outlaw, a person who fought against the prejudice and injustice of the police, or was he a ruthless killer, a man prepared to take the lives of others to save his own. We want you to put Ned Kelly on trial, just as he was committed for trial here at the Beechworth Courthouse and then sent to Melbourne. Like Judge Barry, you might decide that he deserves to be sentenced to be hanged in the gallows in the old Melbourne jail on the 11th of November 1880. Or perhaps you'll decide that he deserves his reputation as a hero in Australian history, an icon that will live forever. You be the judge. It shows a meeting between the crew of a Macassan prau or boat and the local Aboriginal people of Groote Island, situated off the coast of Northern Territory. The Macassans came from what is now called Indonesia, and there's evidence that shows that they had contact with Aboriginal people well before Cook was in the area. So how could he be the first person to discover a place that people from another country were regularly visiting and trading? And listen to what my young friend Gabra Yunupingu told me recently when I visited his family in Gove in the Northern Territory.
Long time ago, back in the dream time, there used to be Aboriginals and Chinese. And every night, the Chinese would go over to the Aboriginal camp and steal the women for slaves.
Well, what do you make of that story? Chinese in Australia before Europeans? Is this evidence that people from a number of different countries were in Australia and encountered Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people before Captain Cook discovered it? I've come from the northern tip of Australia, right down here to the southwest coast of Victoria, to the town of Warrnambool, and I've come to see this monument, presented by the Government of Portugal to commemorate early voyages of navigation in these southern waters. One of these early voyages was taken by a person called Cristóvão de Mendonça in 1524, and the words here read something like this: "We've opened waters